Greetings from San Francisco. My name is Harold McGee. I'm a longtime irregular symposiast. I first came in 1985. And for the last few years, I've been honored to be a trustee of the symposium. I'm very glad for the chance to participate this year, despite everything. And that's entirely due to a team of my fellow trustees who have built this wonderful experience out of nothing in a few months. So my thanks and my congratulations to them. So nosedive into plant aromas. I write about the science of food and cooking, and herbs and spices are materials that I've found especially intriguing from the very beginning, back in the 70s. Why are we so lucky as to have this variety of materials and sensations to cook with and enjoy? Why do these flavors exist? What's their place in the lives of the plants that make them and that have been making them since long before we arrived on the planet to take advantage of them? More recently, this kind of question has led me into investigating aromas of all kinds, pleasant and not so pleasant. And that's the subject of a new book I have coming out this fall called Nosedive, a field guide to the world's smells. But we'll stick in this talk to pleasant smells. I've been delving into plant aromas for decades now in a variety of ways, growing the plants, traveling, especially around the Mediterranean and in India, and dipping into the scientific literature, and sometimes just taking a really close look at familiar ingredients. So what I'd like to do today is share with you a few stories about a few ingredients, in particular vanilla, thyme, and basil, and look at them at scales ranging from the molecule to the landscape. And I hope to persuade you that the biological and chemical dimensions of herbs and spices are nothing to be wary of. They're fascinating. They often illuminate the other fascinating dimensions of foods, and they've never been easier to explore than these days. So, we usually encounter herbs and spices in the pantry. Maybe we have a window box or a few potted plants. Maybe we're lucky enough to have a garden, but usually we encounter these things dried out in glass jars. So the obvious first step for me way back when was to get to know the living plants firsthand. And ever since, I've been surrounded by an odd cast, a changing cast of botanical characters. It used to be a challenge to find and obtain these things, but nowadays it's pretty easy to mail order and get them in just a few days or weeks. And most of them I've found, even tropical plants, do fine in bright windows indoors, sometimes even outdoors. So I strongly encourage anyone who's curious about these things to try growing your plant of interest at any given moment. So these days, I took these photos just a couple of days ago. I have hoja santa, a relative of black pepper that's native to Central and South America. It makes very large leaves that are aromatic and are used to wrap foods and give them flavor. To me, it has the aroma of root beer from my childhood, before the main ingredient in root beer back then, sassafras root, was outlawed. Turns out that sassafras root and hoja santa have the same aromas in common. So I enjoy them now in hoja santa instead of root beer. I also have a curry plant, a curry tree, whose leaves are used a lot in South Indian cooking. They're very hard to find fresh, and it's wonderful to have it just growing in the backyard. Not especially happy, but it's surviving. And then there's Sichuan peppercorn. Just take a look at that close-up of the berries as they're maturing, and you see those dimples. Those fruits are just swollen with an essential oil that to me has become as important and maybe more delightful than the buzzing and numbing that we all associate with Sichuan peppercorns. When they're fresh, they have this amazing citrus floral quality. You can kind of see the fruits shiny. I think the oils leak out because you can smell the berries long before you get to them. My long-term companion is actually a vanilla vine. Vanilla is a native to the tropical forests of Mexico. Turns out that it does just fine in bright, if chilly, San Francisco indoors. Takes a bit longer to grow and to mature, but it eventually does. Vanilla pods, of course, are fruits. They contain seeds. And commercial vanilla is picked green and treated in various ways to maximize the vanilla aroma. But I was curious, it's a fruit, so what's it like when it ripens? I'd never seen vine ripened vanilla on offer. I still haven't seen it, so I do it myself. Turns out that the vanilla plant is an orchid. It grows as a single stem, takes a year or two to get up to door height, and then you let it loop back down and then grow back up again. And that looping and going back and forth is a signal to the plant that it's time to start making flowers. And it turns out that when it does make flowers, these little droplets appear on the flower stalks. They turn out to be exactly what they look like, sugar syrup. And it's not known what they're doing on vanilla exactly, but similar plants in the tropics do the same kind of thing in order to attract ants to the flowers. The ants don't pollinate or anything like that, but they do prevent other creatures from coming along and chewing on the flowers. So that seems to be the function of these little droplets of sweetness. So in order to get fruit, you have to pollinate the flower, of course. And it turns out that this is a tricky thing to do in the absence of the native pollinating insects, which are still not identified, by the way. And that trickiness has delayed the spread, or did delay the spread of vanilla cultivation for a couple of centuries after the conquest. You can see that the pollen is separated from the stigma by a barrier, and you have to somehow get the pollen up around that barrier and into the stigma. So botanists figured this out in the 19th century, the early 19th century. But the practical method that made vanilla cultivation possible, and that is still used today, was developed by a 12-year-old African boy born in slavery on the island of what's now Réunion, who had at the time the single name Edmund. He died free and with a surname, thanks to changes in French law during his lifetime, but he died in poverty. He never saw any benefit whatsoever from his discovery. And that discovery gave birth to a tremendously lucrative global business. So Edmund and his story deserve to be far better known than they are. I think of him every time I try in my fumbling way to do what he did so expertly and get the pollen to the stigma. Anyway, when the vanilla pod does form, it takes about a year in my house to ripen, which is a long time. When it does ripen, it ripens kind of like a thermometer. It starts at the flower end and then rises slowly to the stem end, and as it goes, the aroma changes. The yellow ripe fruit to me, smells like the skin of a banana. Not the banana interior, but the skin. A little bit rubbery, a little bit fruity. And then, of course, as the pod turns brown, it begins to smell like vanilla. And when it gets ripe, the pod splits. You can see it there on both pods. And that exposes the tiny little seeds and the sticky pulp inside that has a lot of the vanilla aroma. Amazingly, to date, no one's really studied why it is that the vanilla pod generates these particular scents, what animal it might have been trying to attract when it evolved to spread the seeds, whether it perhaps is an antifungal agent. It's moist in the tropics and there are lots of plant diseases around. But biologists have observed that there are certain solitary male bees, not European honeybees, but tropical bees that visit open vanilla pods, not for the seeds or for the pulp, but to collect the scent and carry it with them and then display it for females so that they are able to demonstrate that they're bees that get around and so might be good mates. One of the remarkable things about the vanilla pod is that it produces its aroma in tremendous abundance. We all know this practically, how often you can use a single vanilla pod. And in fact, if you let the pod slowly dry out and then carefully cut it open, you can see that there are crystals inside that look more mineral than vegetal. And those crystals are pure vanillin, which is the substance that's the key to the scent of vanilla. Those crystals make visible the fact that smell is a molecular or a chemical sense. Unlike hearing, sight, and so on, touch, it's actually detecting invisible, intangible bits of the material world flying around in the air. And it's so abundant in the pods that it's normally separate molecules, the ones that we detect when they do get into the air, get crowded enough together to form a solid crystal. So that's smell crystallized. Now, vanillin is a chemical compound. And it's something that the flavor industry now synthesizes by the ton with no need for the plant because it's a relatively simple chemical. And one of the distinguishing features of herbs and spices is that they're often dominated by just one or a small handful of chemicals that define their character. So these are some shorthand drawings of some of the molecules of some herbs and spices. And without knowing much, you can see a resemblance, for example, between the anise and tarragon chemicals, anethol and estragol, which suggests that they might have a somewhat similar aroma. And in fact, of course, they do. Safrole, which is the key ingredient in hoja santa and was in sassafras root, is similar but different, has a different kind of decoration on the ring. And then vanillin, of course, is very different yet again. And then oregano and thyme at the very bottom. They're very different from the anise aromatics and from vanillin, but they resemble each other just as oregano and thyme do. So when we smell differences and similarities in herbs and spices and other things, we're actually detecting differences and similarities in the structures of the molecules that we're sensing, and also differences in the proportions when they're mixed together, as they usually are. So it's kind of amazing that our noses are able to discriminate among molecules that, you know, from a distance look kind of the same, but do vary in their details. So when I found out early on that single chemicals can characterize living aromatics, I ordered a few of these chemicals from a supply house to see whether they really did smell recognizably like herbs and spices. And I got myself some Thymol from Sigma Chemical Corporation. It came as a powder that looks kind of like a ground up version of those vanillin crystals. And sure enough, it smelled just like thyme. But I was taken aback when I unpacked the bottle, because this is what appeared on the label: harmful by inhalation. And of course, we enjoy thyme and oregano and things like that by inhalation and exhalation. Harmful by inhalation, in contact with skin, untouchable, and if swallowed. And we swallow it all the time whenever we enjoy it. Irritating the eyes, respiratory system, and skin, so on and so on. So Thymol is a dangerous chemical. And that really brought for me into strong relief the purpose of a lot of these chemicals that we enjoy as aromas in plants. They're often a matter of life and death for the plants. Plants are remarkable creatures. They're able to build themselves out of sunlight and soil and air and nothing else. But they're immobile. They're stuck in one place. They can't defend themselves by fighting or biting or anything like that. So they can be attacked by snails and slugs and caterpillars and whatever's around. So they have to find ways to defend themselves. And one of the most important, in fact, has been their chemistry. They're able to synthesize molecules that they can use for communication and for self-defense, essentially as chemical weapons. So herbs and spices are flavorful because they're stockpiles of warning signals and damaging weapons. And I got a sense for that in the real world when I had the chance in the late 1980s to visit Patience Gray in Apulia, in the far south of Italy. And she took me on an expedition one afternoon into the surrounding countryside, which is largely limestone and very inhospitable to plants, so that the places that do support them end up being very exposed. And any hungry animal, whether it's a human or a herd of goats that the human is keeping, or rabbits or snails or insects, these plants are vulnerable. And so they protect themselves, sometimes very obviously with spines, but other times with invisible, strong, irritating, in high enough quantities, toxic chemicals. So what you see at the lower left is a thyme plant growing in next to no soil whatsoever. And then next to it on the right is a rosemary plant growing basically out of a hole in the rock. I couldn't see any soil around it whatsoever. Those plants are sitting ducks for any creature that's hungry enough. And so they generate the compounds they do in order to survive. This is sometimes called, by the way, because goats and sheep have been kept in the Mediterranean for millennia. These plants are sometimes called anti-pastoral vegetation. Now, if you take a close look at a spearmint leaf, it turns out the mints are in the same family as thyme and rosemary. And you can see that they've got these spikes, which are actually glands that contain the essential oil that gives mint its particular aroma. And you find the same kinds of organs, hairs, glands, things like that on most of the plants in the mint family. This is a close-up of a peppermint leaf, and it's clear that they're gland mines. They're set to spray predators actually even before they are able to get a bite of the leaf. The moment they brush up against the leaf, the glands release their essential oils and begin to irritate. So if you imagine yourself being insect-sized and coming up against this, or being a rabbit and taking a whole mouthful of time, not just a little leaf, you can get a sense for what kind of effect these otherwise pleasant flavors can have in the natural world. We're able to enjoy herbs and spices for sensory stimulation, for interest, for variety, because we're able to dilute them, which means that they're no longer necessarily warnings and weapons. They're no longer concentrated enough to be harmful, but they're still plenty perceptible. And just to give you a sense for how successful this kind of strategy has been, I came across this wonderful posting on the internet from someone in New Zealand, in central Otago. He says, "I've long struggled to grow thyme in my herb garden, but now I know the trick is to start in some mountains that swing from baking heat to bitter cold, then erode your land with sluice mining," which meant just laying waste with tremendous amounts of water. Sluice mine right down to lifeless rock, and then infest it with rabbits and let it be for a century. And what you end up with is this amazing carpet all the way to the horizon of wild thyme, far, far away from its home in the Mediterranean. So it turns out that plants are really virtuoso chemists. So this is a very flexible kind of strategy. Plants are able to make hundreds, thousands of variations on these molecules that have effects on other living things. And the particular sets that they produce reflect the local conditions and what happens to work in a particular place. And they're active against not only animals, insects and rodents and things like that, but plant diseases caused by bacteria and funguses. They're active against competition from other plants, and they can even be used and are used by thyme in particular to control their offspring. It's a form of birth control, because when thyme leaves fall to the ground from the bush, as their seeds often do as well, the leaves actually inhibit the seeds from germinating and growing. And so they prevent the mother plant from being surrounded and outgrown by its own offspring. So these are just a few examples of the different qualities that you can find in wild thyme plants, individual plants in different places. Some of them smell like thyme, others smell minty and camphoraceous. Some are a bit like lime, some are like eucalyptus, some are floral in a lavender direction, some are floral in a rose direction. And it all has to do with the particular molecules that those plants generate and have generated over the course of their adaptation to those surroundings, and that have turned out to work in concert with and against the local neighbors. There's a wonderful illustration of this in the scientific literature that comes from this amazing landscape in central Greece, Meteora. It's in Thessaly. There are monasteries atop some of these pillars, and a couple of ecologists a few years ago decided to look at the kind of variation that you see in herb plants in landscape with such extreme differences in situation. So they published a paper called Defense on the Rocks. And what it has to do with is the difference in the chemical compounds, the aromas produced not by time, but by a relative. Locally, it's known as time basil. And they looked at plants that were growing on top of those pillars. Oop, went a little too quickly. And where, of course, there are no goats or sheep. And then at plants that were growing in the flatlands where people were grazing herds. And what they found was, as they were happy to see, that the more toxic of the molecules that the plant makes were produced in much higher quantities atop, in the lower grazing areas than they were atop the pillars, because atop the pillars, they're not being chewed on much, and so there's no need to bring out the heavy artillery. In the flatlands where they're being grazed on, they produce much more of this compound pulegone, which is the primary compound in the mint called pennyroyal, which in fact has very strong influences, not just on livestock, but on human beings. So it's a component of traditional medicine. Whereas the more minty and not so strong, not so toxic compound menthone is produced in about the same quantities in both places because it doesn't make much of a difference. So anti-pastoral vegetation in the process of being evolved. And the flavors of these Mediterranean herbs, and probably others as well, aren't just determined by predators. They're also influenced by climate. So there's this wonderful study that was done in southern France near Montpellier that discovered or tracked the change in populations of wild thyme in this landscape over the course of a couple of decades. It turns out that in that landscape, there are two main populations of thyme. One that's dominated by thymol, so it's our typical garden aroma. But then there are others that are more piney and floral. And they're intermixed to some extent, but the thymol thyme tends to be dominant higher up, and the piney floral thymes tend to be dominant lower down. And then as you go in between, the proportions change. And the reason for that is that the lower part of this landscape is subject to temperature inversions, and it gets much colder in the hollow than it does up on the slopes. And it turns out that thymol thyme is vulnerable to freezing, so it tends to do better higher up where those temperature inversions don't take place. The piney floral thymes are more tolerant of freezing, and so they're the ones that manage to do better in the depression. And what they've found, this group of ecologists based in Montpellier, is that over the course of 30, or 40 years, as the climate has slowly warmed, this otherwise untouched landscape has changed because the thymol thyme, which is more vulnerable to freezing, has been able to move down into what was the much colder hollow. And there, the Thymol thyme is beginning to take over from the piney floral thymes, because the Thymol thyme is more more able to repel animal predators. So it's doing better on that score. So it's not only predators, it's not only animals and competition that determines what these herbs taste like. It's these complicated climatic aspects as well. Now, there are similar stories that can be told all across the planet. For example, here is the region that's the home of the wild chile in Arizona. It's recognized as a preserve. And it's, again, a landscape where any kind of vegetation really sticks out. It needs to protect itself. So these plants grow in the cracks in the rock. They produce very few leaves. And when they make fruits that are defended against animals that would chew up the seeds and prevent them from being dispersed. Turns out that the molecule that gives the wild chili its heat, capsaicin, is something that really bothers mammals that would chew the seeds up as they chewed the fruit, but it doesn't bother birds at all. And birds just swallow the fruit, it gets digested, and then they defecate the seeds while flying, and the seeds get dispersed, and the bird and the plant are both happy. So that kind of thing happens in the Americas. Then when you get to the old world and to the tropics, it's of course a different story. Plants have much more green company to hide in, but also many more predators and diseases to cope with. So these are monkeys and the lair of a tree bear living in cinnamon trees in the Western Ghats in South India, where my mother went to school many, many years ago. And you can see on the right the sorts of insects that plants have to deal with in places like the Western Ghats. So they also come up with ways to deal with predation and competition and so on. And here is actually not our black pepper, but a very close relative growing in the wild in the mountains, doing something very similar to what the chili does in the arid southwest of North America. That is to say, making little red fruits protected by a very irritating compound, irritating to an animal that's going to try to eat its own weight in these things, but not so irritating to us. To us, it's simply stimulating and enjoyable. And it's really interesting to see that the compounds made by chili peppers, by black pepper, and by Sichuan peppercorns, all of them irritating or annoying in some way, are fairly similar in chemical structure. They're characterized by a chain of carbon atoms and a nitrogen atom somewhere along that chain. So they look similar and they protect themselves with a similar kind of defense. Nutmeg is one of my favorite spices, not only for its aroma, but because it has this kind of threefold and fascinating seed transport and protection system. It's growing in the tree. The fruit grows in the tree. When it's ripe, it splits open and waves this red flag at any passing birds to come pick it up. The fruit itself is nourishing. The red flag is, of course, irritating. We know it as a very aromatic mace. And then when you take a look at the cross-section of a nutmeg seed, what you see is food for the embryonic plant, which is the white areas, and then all the stuff that we're really interested in, kind of lacing through it. The aromatic oils that give nutmeg its just wonderful, wonderful aroma. So again, it's a matter of the seed being protected from predators by lacing its nourishment for the embryo with these chemicals. Cardamom is fascinating too. One of the main varieties actually produces its flowers and fruits on stalks that fall right onto the soil, where it's going to be, pretty easy for all kinds of insects and animals to get at it. And so, of course, it's protected with these very camphoraceous, intense set of molecules. Something that I didn't realize until I went there and tried a few ripe but not yet dried capsules of cardamom, is that the seeds are coated in a pulp that's very sweet. And so, and it's clear from the experience of cardamom farmers that one of the major dispersers of cardamom seeds are rodents of various kinds, mice and rats and so on. They apparently go for the sweet surroundings of the seeds and then just leave the seeds behind. I also think there may be a little bit of visual mimicry going on, because some of these seed clusters look very much like what rodents would leave behind when they were done with something. Anyhow, I'd like to conclude with an example of how we humans take advantage of plant virtuosity and select the flavors we like, elicit different qualities from the vast repertoires of single plants, and come up with dishes that become iconic. So the example is going to be basil. It turns out that this is a species that's native to East India and Africa. There are many different varieties and aromas that humans have appreciated over the generations. And I've seen most of the ones that I've listed here for sale in garden stores. And they run quite a gamut from smelling like spices because they produce the same chemicals, clove or thyme or tarragon, camphor, all the way to floral aromas. And they do in fact share molecules with a number of flowers. Now, our appreciation of basil can sometimes get very, very particular, and that's what I want to tell you about. So, Ocimum basilicum is the most common source of garden basils. And there are, of course, many, many varieties of that particular species. And they're generally classified in several types. There's one that's large-leaved and kind of ruffled leaf and has a tarragon anise kind of aroma, due in fact to the same molecule that we saw in tarragon. Then there are others that contain a mix of different things, floral and eucalyptus and clove and tarragon. And then there's another one, the Genovese type, that is that leaves out estragol, the compound from tarragon, very conspicuously. And it turns out there's a reason for that. So the cultivar, Ocimum basilicum Genovese gigante, has been recognized by the European Union with a protected designation, so it's inscribed in government regulations, that it has to have particular qualities. And what the regulation says is that the basil has a complete absence of minty odor and a very intense and pleasant perfume. That's what the European Union regulation states. More particularly, plant breeders at the University of Bologna have taken a closer look, and what they have found is that, in fact, the Genovese variety gives, the Genovese variety is used largely for pesto, and pesto is better, according to those who are responsible for it, is better without that anise estragol flavor. So according to the University of Bologna, estragol gives a typical mint anise flavor that is considered anomalous and thus undesirable in Genovese and not appreciated by Italian consumers. So that's what defines basil that's proper to pesto, is that it not have that tarragon aroma. So if you're a stickler for authenticity, be sure to vet your basil, either by scent or by pedigree. Well, that's it. I hope that these little sketches of these various things have given you the sense that when we taste a given spice or herb, we're tasting the product of a fascinating web of biological and ecological processes and relationships that underlie the cultural and historical aspects of these things, and that underlie the very direct pleasure that we take in them as we cook and enjoy them. And for all the downsides of globalization and the internet, thanks to those things, it's easier than ever to learn about these aspects of herbs and spices. So if you're interested in learning more, then I encourage you to browse in Google Scholar. See, for example, what Korean food scientists make of alternative nut pestos. And don't let the headspace sort of extraction terminologies scare you off. Skim through the jargon for what you actually want to know, and these days you can find out an awful lot. And I'd also encourage you to try to grow a vanilla plant. It's kind of homely, but it's heavenly. Well, that's it from me. Thanks very much for watching. And I hope to see some of you as well at the Q&A session, which will take place tomorrow, that is Monday, the 13th, at 6 p.m. British Summer Time. Thanks.